Morning Year 9, we are continuing our road along the Cold War to build that foundation for your GCSE. This is Mr. B checking in with you this morning. This is the third lesson, I believe, that we've done so far. Remember, this lesson, in case you haven't done them before, they're all in real time, so you can go through at your own pace. This whole, let's say it's going to be 30-40 minute lesson is one whole solid lesson, so you are able to pause it. We will go through, do tasks, do things along the way. I'm going to be talking you through everything that you need to know. If you have not done any of these lessons yet, you can go back into the archive, you can go onto the YouTube channel, and you can go back and you can do the ones that we have yet to, if you have any to complete, you can complete those at your own pace. Thank you to those of you who have completed work, emailed work to me and your teachers. Some really great stuff going on, so thank you very, very much for that. And don't forget, this is all explicitly relevant to you and your GCSE. A lot of this stuff we're going to be coming back to in September, touch wood, touch my skull, in case we do come back in September. Basically, this is going to form the foundation of that. So we're going to be chatting about a lot of these things again. So if you want to know what we're chatting about come September, then it might be a good idea to go through and complete this as best as you can. Anyway, so today, lesson 3, we are looking at how a shadow fell across Europe in the 1940s. So that is your title today. If you want to do it that way, it's the 16th of June 2020, of course. You can get your date and title as it would be a normal lesson, should you wish. I'm not going to be having a go at you for not underlining things. And today, our objective is to explain what happened in Eastern Europe after the Second World War, because that's where we're picking up. That's where our story of the Cold War really begins. We're not worried about what happened during the Second World War. It's really what happens as a result after it. You're going to complete a table, as is standard in history. We do love our tables in history. And you will apply your knowledge to historical evidence, and you are going to write a paragraph, a very short paragraph. It's not a huge paragraph, don't panic, about assessing the meaning of a cartoon. So let's talk then. Let's get you up and running with this then. So we do need to mention the Second World War, and here is a little map that I've photographed. Sorry, it's not the best quality, but it's the best I can do, I'm afraid. This is essentially what happened during the Second World War. What Germany managed to do, our focus is really across Eastern Europe, but you can see they, at the beginning of the war, during their blitzkrieg, they absolutely decimated Western Europe. Much of France was conquered, Belgium, the Netherlands, but you can see here, huge swathes of Eastern Europe were controlled by the Nazis. This is Operation Barbarossa, I believe, and it sort of, that was when Hitler turned his back on Stalin, because remember they signed that Nazi-Soviet pact in 1939. He basically tore that to shreds, because remember, for Germany, for Nazism, the real enemy was communism over here in the USSR. And if you don't know what communism is, I suggest you go back to lesson 1 on YouTube, cheap plug, and complete that lesson, because that'll tell you everything you need to know. All right, but all you need to know is huge areas of land had been conquered by Germany in the Second World War. But of course, as we well know, the tables were turned, and what happened was that the USSR managed to muster together their army, and they actually drove the Nazis back through Eastern Europe, as did D-Day. So when D-Day was launched, sorry, that's my dog shaking in the background. So what D-Day was launched, and they attacked Normandy, the beaches of Normandy, and then they came down in. So basically Germany was sandwiched in the middle, which was their nightmare, which we've talked about time and time again. So what we do is we go from a situation of, in the early 1940s, at the beginning of the Second World War, towards the beginning, you've got huge areas of Eastern Europe that have been conquered by the Nazis, but by the end of the Second World War, of course, the USSR has turned around and driven out the Nazis. And essentially what has happened here is it has been, quote, liberated. Now, to liberate something is to free something. So what the USSR had managed to do is they marched straight through Eastern Europe, drove out the Nazis, and now these countries were supposedly free. And that is something we will come back to time and time again. So the question we really need to ask ourselves is, or the question that the Allies had to ask themselves in 1945, when it was clear that that Second World War was coming to an end, they really had to ask themselves, well, what the heck do we do now? What do we do with Eastern Europe? What do we do with Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, etc., etc.? What do we do with those countries? And it goes back to this event here. February 1945, the Yalta Conference. You've seen a picture very, very similar here. Remember Churchill for the United Kingdom, Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt for the United States. He's the president, of course. And we've got Joseph Stalin, the premier of Russia. These three we've met before in our story. And as you can see, the relationship is really cordial at this point. But of course, they've got to make the decision. What the heck do we do with this huge area here? It's now been liberated from Nazi Germany. It's now controlled by the Russians, remember. So these three gentlemen here, three of the most powerful individuals on the entire planet at this point, they decide at Yalta, at this meeting that they have, a very, very famous meeting between the Allied leaders at Yalta in 1945, they decide to have free elections in Eastern Europe. So all of these liberated countries, the basic plan is that they will decide freely who should now run their country. The idea is that the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe is going to be the Russian occupation. That's what I mean by Soviet. That is merely going to be a temporary thing until there are, quote, free elections in Eastern Europe. Now, you might be telegraphing that actually it might not go down quite as straightforwardly as one might be able to imagine. So, over to you now. What you've got to do is you have got this document here. This is a PDF document that is on ePraise. So that is much clearer on ePraise, so you can look at it properly on there. You can use this, but the writing is not particularly great. If you want to strain your eyes, that's absolutely fine. But what I want you to do is I want you to look at these pink countries here. All right. Now, what you want to do is you want to take a look at three of those countries. You don't have to do those ones at all. You don't have to do those ones at all. It's not particularly those that you need to look at. They're just an example to demonstrate what you need to do. Poland is quite an interesting one, but you can look at any of those countries that you like, and I want you to explain how did it become communist? Because I think what we should really telegraph here is that as soon as Russia controls these countries, Russia is a communist country, they are of course going to become communist. So what I want you to do is I want you to explain the process of which that happened, because they are being occupied here. But actually what is going to happen is all of these countries are going to become communist. And we need to establish how that happens after 1945. So what you need to do is take a look at each country or three of those countries, and I want you to try and establish how they became communist. What is happening within those countries to mean that they become communist? Are there elections? Are there other things going on perhaps? What is the role of the USSR maybe in some of these countries? But I want you just to briefly, you don't need to do all of them because you'll be here forever and it's really, really boring. So don't bother about that. Just worry about three countries and try and build a picture about how these countries are becoming communist. Because what's going to end up happening is, instead of these countries going to be, instead of being Nazi, as is shown here, they are actually going to become communist. Okay, so take a look at those countries, pause this video, and you can complete this little task. So you need a table like so. Make sure you can write in the table. You don't want a teeny tiny table that you can't write in. And also, there is the extra here. If you want, Greece and Yugoslavia are the exceptions here. So if you're doing Yugoslavia on your table, you might sort of see something slightly different to the others. But I want you to tell me, if you want to go that little bit further, why it was slightly different in Greece and Yugoslavia. So pause the video and we'll check back in just a few moments where I will take it further, and I'll basically explain to you what's going on here. Okie dokie. Right, so essentially there are several themes that are going on here. All right, all of these countries are going to become communist. Some countries had elections. Some people, some countries did have elections, and communism was genuinely very, very popular. In many countries, however, you can see they won an election here, etc., etc. In Hungary, yes, they were very popular, and in some countries they actually became what we call the largest party. So they didn't outright win the election, but the people chose, many, many millions of people would have legitimately chosen communism as a way forward. We will try and establish, actually next lesson, we will establish why people may have chosen communism after the Second World War. But the nature of that changed very, very quickly. You can see in many of these countries, such as Hungary, they won the election, but actually what the communists did was they imprisoned the other politicians in the countries. They executed some politicians that disagreed with what they wanted to do, and abolished the monarchy in the case of Hungary. They would forcibly drive out other politicians who were either working with the government in a coalition or who were opposed to the government. In some countries, there was a communist uprising. There was, communists came to power through force, and that was encouraged by the USSR. In other countries, such as Bulgaria, communists came to power, and there was little opposition to this. People were quite happy, or should I say initially, they were quite happy with their choice. And you can see here in the case of Albania, again, gained power, had very, very little opposition. So you can see that there's a pattern here, a bit of, yes, there's a legitimate choice here, but in some countries, and you can see here in East Germany, it is a case of the USSR merely dominating. Because what you've got to bear in mind is, in all of these countries, overseeing these elections are going to be the Red Army. The Red Army is the Russian Communist Army. So you're unlikely, perhaps, to be somebody who's going to actively speak out against communism when you have got the might of the Russian army stationed in your country. So to say that they're legitimate elections is really quite interesting. In a lot of cases, basically, you're getting the gist of the USSR is stirring the pot here. The USSR is sort of massaging a lot of these results, and they are undermining a lot of governments. They are putting obstacles in the way for legitimate other parties to take control. So basically, the USSR is causing trouble, and the communists within those countries are acting in a way that is politically intolerant. That is to say that they do not allow other parties to do what they want. The exceptions are Yugoslavia and Greece. So let's talk about Yugoslavia very, very briefly. Yugoslavia is an interesting one. You can see that it's pink. It is communist, but it is not controlled by the USSR. Actually, there's a leader called Tito, and Tito is a war hero who is a communist who fought against the Nazi regime, and he is incredibly popular to the point whereby they want him to be the leader, and he is resistant to Stalin telling him what to do. So you can see how actually Yugoslavia was given its specific nature and its role in the Second World War. They were slightly different, and you can see in Greece that did not go communist. And if you did read it, why? Well, because the West, the UK and the USA, particularly the UK, supported non-communists to fight against a communist takeover. And you can also see here that East Germany, Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria, they were enemies of the USSR during the Second World War. They had nothing to do with the USSR before. However, Poland was an ally of the USSR. So you can see that Stalin and communists within those countries are asserting themselves. And what has basically happened is you've now got a situation where communism dominates Eastern Europe. Communism has taken over huge swathes of land in Eastern Europe. And it is, well, we need to think now about what the reaction to this is. Because you can probably foretell that there's going to be some people, many people, that are not going to be particularly happy about this. Just a quick note before we do move on. You can see that even in countries that did not go communist, so France is an example, Italy is another example, communism was incredibly popular. There were strong communist parties that wanted to take over, but for circumstances that we will go into next week, that did not happen. So it's all about perception with the Cold War. It is all about how this is viewed by the different superpowers. This is a different map, but it essentially says the same thing. It illustrates here. I'm moving my hand. I'm touching the flipping screen, and of course you can't see it, so I'll use the mouse. Anyway, so huge areas of land are now controlled by communism. How is this perceived? How is this perceived by Truman and the West? Well, for Truman and the West, it confirms their suspicions all along. It shows that Russia was what we call expansionist. It shows that communism was determined to spread, or Russia was determined to spread communism throughout Eastern Europe and throughout the entire world. And this went against those agreements at Yalta. Because remember, at Yalta, it was agreed there would be free elections in these countries. And you can see, based on this map, how, given the fact that the Red Army were all in all these places, given the fact that there were communists dominating and manipulating things so that they gained power, you can hardly say the elections in these countries were, quote, free. And according to the West, according to America, this totally went against what was being agreed at Yalta. That agreement that Stalin himself made, admittedly it wasn't Truman, but Stalin did make that agreement. According to them, it is throwing that totally out of the window. And therefore, Stalin could not be trusted, and it confirmed Truman's iron fist approach. I think I briefly mentioned it in a previous lesson, but Truman is very different, and we will talk about this again next lesson. Truman is different than Eisenhower, than Roosevelt, beg your pardon, Eisenhower. Truman was very different than Roosevelt when it comes to tackling communism. He saw communism as a threat that should be should have an iron fist approach. Usually, if I'm teaching the iron fist, I smash the table with my hand and then smash up the bones in my hand. So the iron fist approach was the description of how Truman wanted to be tough on communism, certainly in comparison to Roosevelt, who recognized that communism was established in the world, it wasn't going anywhere, and you needed probably to work with it more. He didn't like communism, but Roosevelt felt you needed to work with it, whereas Truman had his iron fist. So essentially, this establishment of communism in Eastern Europe was evidence to Truman and the West and Britain, particularly in Britain, because Britain were very, very afraid, because Britain is only just up here. So it is reasonably close, very close, certainly compared to the USA, which is all the way over here. It's very, very close to the spread of communism. So Britain certainly felt particularly under threat. But as with everything, you think of when there's beef between you and your friends, and there's goss and beef going on at break and lunchtime, back in the good old days. There are two sides to every single story. Yes, we can see how Stalin is actively spreading communism, how the Red Army did dominate Eastern Europe, how they did oversee these elections. Stalin went in, and see this area here, Stalin just went and took those areas. So places like Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania, he just went in and conquered those, and they were totally dominated by the Soviet Union. But why did he do this? Well, there are a couple of reasons why. And it's all about thinking about it from Stalin's perspective. Stalin is not a nice chap by any stretch of the imagination. but there is logic to him as to why he is doing these things. So for example, for instance, he saw Eastern Europe as what we call his sphere of influence. What does that mean? Well, it means that the Soviet Union is right next to Eastern Europe. There was basically an agreement, particularly between him, Stalin and Churchill, that actually this was an area whereby Stalin should have some kind of say in what is going on, because it's right next door to his country. Remember, the Soviet Union the USSR is a huge, powerful country. And according to Churchill, they should absolutely have a say in what is going on in areas that is right next door to the USSR. Why does Churchill agree to this? Well, if you know your context, Britain at this time in the 1940s, it was a far cry from its glory days, but Britain did still have an empire. So Churchill wanted to make sure that the Soviet Union had no eyes on some of the British dominions overseas. So what he did was he thought he would placate Stalin by saying, yes, you're absolutely right, in Eastern Europe, you should have a say in what's going on, because he didn't want Stalin challenging him in Britain about their colonies, their countries that they controlled around the world, including India at this point. But another reason why Stalin is doing this is because Stalin wanted Eastern Europe to act as a buffer against future attacks. What you've got to bear in mind is tens of millions of people were killed in Russia during that Second World War. It's around the 20 million mark. 20 million soldiers, 20 million casualties during the Second World War. It might even be 20 million deaths. I can't remember off the top of my head. But 3 times, or twice in particular, Germany had attacked Russia twice in the 20th century. Twice within Stalin's lifetime, Germany, which is here, had attacked Russia. The West had also interfered in the Russian Civil War, remember, in the 1910s. So you can see how actually that takes it to 3. So 3 times in the 20th century, a Western country has had their troops in Russia. And to Stalin, he was very, very fearful of Germany. And this is one of the key issues in the post-war, in post-war Europe. Russia was fearful of Germany attacking them again. And basically, Stalin's logic is to use these countries as a buffer. So, should Germany here, if they do decide to attack Russia again, they would have to go through Russian-controlled East Germany. They'd have to go through Czechoslovakia. They'd have to go through Russian-controlled Poland. They'd have to go through what we call the Baltic states here. This huge area of land also controlled by the Russians before they get to the Soviet Union. So in the meantime, while Germany is marching through here, blah, 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 the Soviet Union can, in effect, mobilize their troops and get ready for attack. That is Stalin's logic, and that is perfectly reasonable logic when you think about the amount of problems that Russia has had with Germany in Stalin's own lifetime. But of course, when we talk about this issue of trust, Truman would go on about the issue of trust. The Soviet Union can't be trusted. They said at Yalta they'd do this, blah, 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 blah. Well, Stalin would turn around and say, you, the USA, also cannot be trusted. In that, at Hiroshima, when Truman used the atomic bomb, he made no mention of it to Stalin, although Stalin did know what was going on because he had spies going into the USA and telling him what was going on. The USA had not told Stalin about the atomic bomb, so therefore the trust has already been undermined from Stalin's point of view. And added to that, Stalin is, by his very nature, very, very paranoid in terms of his position and in terms of being very suspicious of the West. But to those of you who do want to think bigger, I want to, if you don't want to go through this bit, fine, you can skip ahead to the next bit. But I do just briefly want to touch on this, the thinking bigger idea. I just wonder if any of you have thought about this. If you want to pause the video and give it some thought and write something down, that is absolutely fine. Otherwise, listen up. Was the agreement at Yalta destined to fail, I ask? Well, you could argue that yes, it could have been. I mean, look. Don't want to do that. Right, at Yalta, free elections, remember? Think about capitalism and communist ideas about free elections. Do communists like Stalin believe in, quote, free elections? Does Stalin see elections in the same way as Eisenhower? From lesson 1, you should have already established this. No, they don't. They see elections and democracy and government in two very, very different ways. Stalin believes in dictatorship. Yes, communists do have elections, but you choose from which Communist Party candidate that you want to go and help run the government or vote on laws. For Roosevelt and Churchill, of course, for these Western areas here, democracy is, or free election is about having competing political parties that are able to put their proposals of how the country should be run, their manifestos to the country, and then people decide. It's a competition. It's classic capitalism. It's a competition between political parties as to who should run the country. But for Stalin, that is not how he sees a free election. To him, a free election is having an army overseeing what's going on, having your rigged elections and things like that. So when we ask ourselves the question, was the agreement at Yalta destined to fail? It could easily be that it was destined to fail because you have got this fundamental difference of opinion. Capitalism and communism, those two competing ideologies. And remember, right at the very beginning, I think I said, they are two fundamentally different views of how the world should be run. And throughout the Cold War, there was little to no effort on either party to try and understand which side of the coin they are arguing. Okay, so it's all about perception. So the spread of communism in Eastern Europe is really important to understanding what is going on and why things are happening and how this influences the Cold War. So I'm going to move on. We are now going to apply some of our knowledge to a piece of historical evidence, in this case a cartoon. So the question we're going to pose to you is, source A is critical of the USSR. That is, of course, referring to Russia. How do you know? So you're going to use source A. That should have a capital. You're going to use source A and your knowledge. So first of all, the first place you should go to, you should all regurgitate it like parrots. Certainly if I teach you, you should. Your eyes do not go on the lovely picture. Go straight onto that caption. This, by the way, is a type of exam question. So what I want you to do is I want you to look at this caption, and I want you, classic Mr. B history, to answer these questions. What is the source? When was the source made? Who made the source? And why was the source made? So jot down those questions. If you want a printout of this, I will put a PDF of this onto ePraise, but otherwise you can just jot it down. You do not need to have a copy of this, a hard copy of this. You can use the screen. But you need to answer those questions. So jot those questions down and briefly answer them. So I'm going to pause, or I want you to pause this video, and I'll check back in about 5 seconds, and we'll take it further, and I'll give you some ideas as to what I think the answers to these questions are. So pause the video and off you go. Okie dokie. So the what is quite straightforward. It is, of course, a cartoon because it states right there. When was the source made? It was made in 1948. And remember, you have to put this into context. It's not enough just to say, ooh, 1948. In your brain, you need to be putting these pieces together. So, context, 1948. Second World War is over. Capitalism versus communism. The Cold War is beginning. Apologies for my email pinging. The atomic bomb has been used by 1948, and communism, crucially, has spread across Eastern Europe. Who made this source? Well, it's a British cartoonist, so you need to maybe think about what sort of view that is going to show. Maybe think about Britain's role in the capitalist communist Cold War. Well, of course, it is going to show a capitalist view. And why was this source made? Well, as with all cartoons, it is designed to make a political point. It is a form of propaganda. It is expressing a view. It is a piece of information that is designed to change the way you think, isn't it? All right, but it's all cartoons are designed to entertain and make a political point. So you've done that bit. That is the first bit you do. Now you can go to this lovely picture here by the legendary David Lowe. Now, you are going to pick out the key parts of this cartoon. Now, if you do not have a hard copy of this, you can, of course, do it as bullet points. It's absolutely fine. But I want you to think about what it shows and what it may mean. So you're thinking about making those inferences. What is the meaning behind what you see? Remember, there is no detail that is too small. You can see here, I have made this bit bigger so you can read that nice and clearly. So what I want you to do, and that there, it tells you who that is. So I want you to think about what you can see and what does it mean. Pause the video, do bullet points. If you've got the hard copy that you're able to print off, great. You can draw arrows off it. I really don't mind. But as long as you're getting the idea of the meaning behind what is shown here, pause the video and I'll check in just a minute and give you my thoughts. Okie dokie, so what have we got here? Right, well, let's have a think then. So we can see that we've got this chap here. All right, this is Molotov. This is the foreign minister of Russia. He's basically in charge of how Russia deals with other countries. And it can tell us here in the caption who that is. So you can see that what he is doing is he is spinning the globe here, I think. And he is pointing, it's almost like, where do you want to go on holiday? Think, Mr. B, in my classroom, I've got my big old globe that I like to use sometimes. I like to throw that at people. Never students, of course. So I spin it around often and decide where I'm going to go on holiday. And then you point, okay, where am I going to go on holiday? Oh, I'm going to go to Algeria. That's nice. This is exactly what's happening here, but you can probably infer that this is nothing to do with going on holiday, and in fact the caption here from the cartoon will give you a gist of where this is. Who's next to be liberated from freedom, comrade? So comrade is just a term used by communists and people of the left in particular, politically, to sort of describe people who have the same political views as them, or who are members of the same party. So, of course, are they really being liberated? Are they really being freed? Well, it's used ironically, isn't it? Because it's liberating them from freedom. So you're freeing them from freedom. Remember, they were conquered by the Nazis during the Second World War. The Soviets went in and liberated, quote them. But of course, what they're saying is they're liberating them from freedom rather than liberating them from Nazism. That's the point, isn't it? So you can see they're spinning around. So essentially the decision is which country is going to be taken over next. You can see that, you can see this here, that Stalin, and we'll talk about his facial expression in just a moment, he is flicking all the switches. And you can see that Czechoslovakia switches down, Hungary switches down, Poland switches down, Greece, the switch is up, France, the switch is up, Italy, the switch is up. You can see what the meaning is here, hopefully, that, if you look at it in real depth, France, Italy, Greece, where else have we got? Turkey, Persia, that's Iran. They're all switched up. That means they are not communist. If they're switched down, that clearly means that they have gone communist. And you know from your knowledge that Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, Poland have all gone communist. So basically it's getting at the fact that Stalin is choosing which country is going to be next in his plans for not just the conquest of Eastern Europe, is it? This is suggesting by bringing in Persia and Turkey, etc., etc., you can see here that Its plans and the globe shows plans for world domination, not just the domination of Eastern Europe. Stalin's expression, you can see here, voila, is one of happiness, isn't it? He is really quite contented about the prospect of taking over these countries. And if you notice Marshall here, who is the US politician I mentioned earlier on briefly, he is going to be important in our story next lesson, but he is looking eye to eye with George Marshall, and he has got a conceited, devious grin on his face. This is, Stalin is relishing the prospect of spreading communism across the world. Okay, so those are your key details. And of course, what you've got to bear in mind is that this is made by a British cartoonist. So that may give you an indication of why they show this particular view. So it's over to you now. So I want you to try and answer this question. You don't have to write for very much for this. That's the joy of this kind of question. It's literally one paragraph. And it's really, you've done the thinking already. You're telling me what source A suggests. Okay, so what's the overall message of the cartoon? Go back, think about it. You can rewind the video, of course. Think about what the message is overall. Okay, think about what the meaning of those things in the cartoon is. It shows, pick out aspects that you have identified and explain their meaning. Don't just say, it shows Stalin flicking a switch. Okay, what does that mean? What's the significance? What's the importance of that? It shows this because, now, you want to think about knowledge. You want to tell me what is happening across Eastern Europe. What is happening, why it is happening. You know that. You've got the notes on your bit of paper or whatever you're writing on, hopefully. And you can go back in the video to look at that map as we've done already. And you want to think about the what, when, who, why. Remember, we did the what, when, who, why already. You can go back in the video. You can pause this. It's up to you. But, of course, remember who is writing it. Whose point of view is it going to be showing? Is it going to be showing the same message if this cartoon was made in Russia? I would suggest probably not. So I want you just to jot down. So the chunky bits are this bit. This shows this because. The chunky bit is your knowledge and the what, when, who, why. And you are picking aspects of the source, okay, and explaining what they mean. Those are your two chunky bits. That is literally one sentence. Overall, you need to explain how you know it is critical of Russia, of the USSR. So pause this video, and get jotting down your ideas. Write that little paragraph. Okie doke. Now, what you can do now that you've written that paragraph is you now have to go through and look at the things that you need to do. So this is a checklist of all the things that you need to do for a successful answer. Remember, it's not a very long answer. It starts with the simple things and it goes higher and higher and higher. So what you're doing is you're going through and you can either tick or underline where you think you have done this. I want you to look at it. I don't want you, we are not going to mark it. One, it will take forever, and B, you are actually able to do this yourself. You can go through, you can pick out the key things, and you can show where you have done this. Have you picked out a relevant part of the source? I flippin' hope you have. I think that's pretty straightforward. You can suggest the meaning of the parts of source. If you've done that, tick it. If you have given knowledge on the events in Eastern Europe, you tick that with your piece of work. If you do all of these things, make sure you tick them, all right? You don't need to print any of this off, but you are just going through and it's just about that process. I'm not worried about how it looks. I'm just worried about you taking the time, rereading, have I done those things? Because I think those things are the things that you need to do a particularly great answer. If you have not done this, if you have not done these things, maybe down the bottom, and you want to after you've written the paragraph, that is absolutely fine. All right, you should only have spent about 5 minutes writing that, so it's not too onerous, I hope. If you think you've done all that, if you've linked to the wider events and talked about the provenance, the what, when, who, why, and how it affects the message, if you've talked maybe about it being a British cartoon, wink, wink, showing a capitalist view, that is going to get you that's going to make it a real top answer. All right, so if you want to go through and look at that again, go through it. So pause this video and go back and take a look at it, and I will check it in just a moment, whereby we will wrap things up. Okay, so a summary. By 1948, the poor old people of Eastern Europe, the people of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, etc., etc. What we have here is we have a situation whereby the people of Eastern Europe have gone from being conquered by Nazis to being dominated by communists. Russian communists in particular. So for the people of Eastern Europe, it's a story of just one of oppression. They are being oppressed they're still being oppressed, but is by a different oppressor, isn't it? For the USSR, this is imperative. This domination of Eastern Europe is absolutely imperative for the protection of the USSR, and to make sure that they are safeguarded against future attack, against an untrustworthy and threatening Western capitalist world that threatens the very existence of communism and the Soviet Union. For the West, however, for Britain and the USA and France, this is a terrifying omen. This is a portent of doom. It is clear evidence to the USA and the Western capitalist powers that Stalin is wanting to conquer the whole world, that communism is not content to just remain in the Soviet Union, in Russia. It is instead pursuing what we call an expansionist policy, whereby Stalin wants to spread communism across Eastern Europe and across the world. On the other side of the doorstep, of the frontier, okay, what you've got is Western Europe. The rest of Germany, which we'll talk about at a later date, I'm sure. The rest of Germany is threatened. France is threatened. Italy is threatened. All of these countries are threatened because of the spread of communism across Eastern Europe. And it is therefore evidence to Truman, the President of the United States, that using the atomic bomb was absolutely right, and that his iron fist, tough approach against communism is the way forward. It is the way to deal with Stalin, who cannot be trusted, who reneged on his promises made at the Yalta conference just 3 years earlier in February 1945. So you can see that overall, that the relationship, that wartime friendliness, if I go back to that picture, quite a lot today, haven't we? That wartime friendliness, as is illustrated in this picture, is certainly out of the window. It's deteriorated to such an extent whereby each of the superpowers, let's go back, I'm going too far, beg your pardon, whereby each of the superpowers cannot trust each other when it comes to here. So what has happened at this point is that there has been a further deterioration to the point whereby relations between the USA and the USSR is at a particularly low ebb by the end of the 1940s. We're not quite there by the end of the 1940s, but you can see that the Cold War really is now starting to bite. So let's wrap things up, shall we? That ought to do it. I'm going to sign off now. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope, crucially, that you have found this useful. That is the main thing when it comes to this. I want this to be useful. Please email any work that you have done, your written paragraph with your self-assessment and your table. Please email that to your history teacher. We look forward to reading it. If you've not yet gone through some of those old lessons, please do so. It will all be on, it's all on YouTube. And thank you for those that have listened and taken part. Again, I hope it's been useful, and we'll be back with another lesson, taking our work on the Cold War forward. And I shall see you, well, sort of. I look forward to engaging with you all, shall I say, next week. Take care.